I would like to call up Leslie Johnston, the Laudes Foundation, and all the wonderful speakers that she brought with her today to talk about the missing middle. Please give them an applause.
Thank you. Oh, do you have this one? I'll give you that. Should I take that one?
That's fine, yeah.
Okay, welcome everyone. This brings back memories of karaoke, which maybe later we could do that. So wonderful that you're here with us. My name's Leslie. I run a foundation called Laudes Foundation, which is focused on how do we accelerate the transition that needs to happen across key industries while putting people at the center. And I'm really excited for this discussion today because, I'll go ahead and sit down. We want this to be interactive, but the reason why I'm excited is hopefully everyone here in the room cares about climate and nature, right? Yes. I hope. Yes. Good. It sounds crazy even saying that, but we do care about that. And we also feel by being here that there is a sense of urgency to act. You probably remember back in September, we actually passed, I think it was the 7th of the 9 planetary boundaries. So that's really scary stuff. And we are definitely in a situation that requires urgency and action. And we also recognize, especially at Laudes and especially our partners, that business, industry, and finance has the power to accelerate this change that we want to see. And that's very exciting, but we also know it's really not that easy. So what we want to talk about today is fashion, and use the fashion industry as an example of how philanthropy with partners like these, investors, can actually accelerate a change that, let's be honest, is not happening fast enough. And why fashion? Well, fashion is something that we all touch. We all wear clothes, usually. But more importantly, it's big. It's about 2 trillion in size. That's about 2% of GDP. It's messy. It's globalized. There's a lack of transparency, sometimes a lack of accountability. It's growing. It's linked to population growth. So the problems we see with fashion around climate, nature degradation will only continue as populations grow. It's speeding up. We're going from fast fashion to instant fashion, which is also a big challenge. And it is, as are most of my relationships, very complicated. And I know this is a live stream, so hopefully my husband's not watching this. And by complicated, what we want to talk about today is the missing middle. I won't say what the missing middle is because it's a question for our panelists, but really where we want to focus is that middle of the supply chain, that sometimes quite dirty, small, fragmented part of fashion, you know, the spinners, the dyers, that really need to change, that really have a lot of negative impact, both environmentally and socially, but it's really hard to change it. So we're going to talk about how these partners are doing that. And if we get this right, it could be incredibly impactful. So I'm really excited to hear what they have to say. I'm excited to support their work, but also excited to hear what you have to say. So let's dig into this a little bit more. And before we do that, I want to know who's in the room. So we have a little bit of a Slido. So take out your phone. Whoopsie. And give me a sec. Okay. I think, is this it? Okay. No, the next one. Is it the next one? Right, okay. So, there we go. Okay, so what type of actor are you representing? So we want to know who's in the room. Academia, banking, business. We promise we won't call out the bankers. We love bankers. Charities, consultancies, investors, media, multilaterals, philanthropy. Should we go back? Yeah. Sorry about that. Okay, there we go. Okay, I'll give you... Are you all in? Okay. All right, I'm going to go to the next. And is there a magic hand from above that will make the results show? Okay, we might have to do this old school way with hands. No? Nothing? Darn. Okay, technology. Do you? Oh. Okay, let's not do that. Let's do hands. Sorry. We're very adaptable. Okay, so who in the room represents philanthropy? Okay, wonderful. Who represents business of some sort? Fantastic. We love you. Who represents finance? Investors. Wonderful. Who represents nonprofits, civil society? Fantastic. Okay, academia? All right. Okay, we need you guys. You help us make the business case for things. What am I missing? Government? Wonderful. You make the rules. We love that. Anything? Am I missing anything? Media, yes. Fantastic. Stay strong. Okay, all right. So we have a great mix, and that's what's important. And because we can't get the Menti to work, I'm not going to go into the other questions, which are really around what you see as the challenges in the space, but we have time for a Q&A, and we can go into that. So with that, let me introduce our panel, and they're going to introduce themselves in more detail. But what I'm really excited about, we have a nice mix of organizations representative. We have Gauri, who actually represents the Fashion Producer Collective, and so she'll bring the supplier perspective and much, much more. We have Valerie, who's representing the Asia Investor Group on climate change, and that is going to give us the perspective on what the asset owners feel, look, do, and also the regional perspective, because there's a lot of exciting things happening in Asia. We have Bob, who's with the Good Fashion Fund and also the founder of the fund manager that manages it, and he'll bring a practitioner lens to investing. And we have Olivia, who is with PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, and she's going to bring a system-level investor perspective. So super excited about that, but let me let each of them say who they are and why they're here. So start with you.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about the technological challenges. We were joking earlier that there's a lot of talk about AI, and sometimes we still struggle with like polls and such. But anyway, I am Gauri. I represent the Fashion Producer Collective. As Leslie mentioned, Fashion Producer Collective was set up to elevate producers' collective voice and enable them to collaborate on projects that they care about in sustainability. So that's a little bit about FPC. I handle strategy and engagement for FPC. In today's conversation, I'll be drawing on about a decade of experience working in fashion supply chains, on decarbonization, dry processing, traceability, multi-stakeholder partnerships, and also a lot on my master's dissertation, which looked at buyer and supplier relationships in the fashion industry, which is something I would really like to talk about today as a big challenge in financing as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Hope this is coming through all right. My name is Valerie Kwan. I am the Director of Stewardship at the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change. So we are a investor cohort of platform where we bring together investors to engage on climate issues. And I've been with the organization for 7 years now, and next year we will be celebrating our 10th year anniversary, just to give a bit of context as to the age of the organization as we come along. But most importantly, what I hope to bring into the table today in today's discussion is from my experience working with investors on collaborative engagement with various sectors. So arguably, I'll have to say my background is a little bit more towards the heavier industry side, but I think that there are pain points that are sort of felt across the value chain, which are very common challenges that would be felt in the apparel sector as well. And I hope that would be a useful insight for our exchange. But also, very importantly, as the organization, as AIGCC has grown, we've started off with these sort of collaborative engagement initiatives, but now we are really very much focused on delivering what's needed by investors in the region, and therefore we have developed numerous different thematic working groups the Just Transition Working Group being one, which is incredibly important, which is led by our fantastic Just Transition team as well. And so I'll be leaning on a lot of the outputs from that working group as well later on. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And maybe just a fun fact that fashion is, I think, one of the biggest users of chemicals. So if you're focused on heavy industry, I don't know if you consider chemicals heavy industry, but yeah, it's important. So good to hear that you have that focus. Bob, over to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. I'm Bob Assenberg. As Leslie already mentioned, I'm the co-founder of Found, an impact investment firm. We're managing a couple of funds, including the Good Fashion Fund. Typically, what we do with the other funds are all blended finance funds. So it's basically a collaboration between different kind of investors with different kind of focus. So there are the foundations, concessional funders really looking at the impact and trying to enhance the impact, combined in order to get a bigger pool of money, also combined with development banks, but also sometimes with institutional or banks funders. So what we do with our other funds is that we really look at innovative financing structures where we really have a supply chain approach. So what we try to do, we look at structures like guarantees, we look at offtake agreements, we really try to get, I would say, the full chain included in the funds. And we also have a fund, for instance, pre-financing carbon finance. So what we try to do is take that and also use that for the Good Fashion Fund. Particularly, I think the first fund initiated by the Laudes Foundation and also Fashion for Good. Blended Finance Fund, Laudes is an investor, but also the Mills Fabrica, which is a Hong Kong family office, as well as the Rabobank, a Dutch commercial bank. Really was set up at the time, and it was already Just Transition. It's becoming sort of well known now, but it's Just Transition looking at the environmental improvements of the fashion sector, particularly at supplier level, and also looking at the improvements that are needed and have to be included on the social side as well. So looking at the social and also the environmental matters, we did that by bringing finance, long-term finance, in order to match the long-term plans of the suppliers, but also bringing support by working together with local partners. And I'm happy to share a little bit of the learnings that we have and also some experiences and how we're going to take it further from here.
And for those investors in the room, they are actually fundraising for fund number 2, which is super exciting because fund number 1's been very, very successful. So well done there. Great, Olivia.
Hi, everyone. So I am Olivia Villette. I'm the head of Switzerland and Liechtenstein at the PRI, so the Principles for Responsible Investment. So for those of you that are not from Switzerland, welcome. I hope you're not too cold and doing okay. So the Principles for Responsible Investment is an initiative for investors, asset owners, investment managers, and service providers. We have over 5,000 signatories globally, and we support them. We support them in having practices, investment practices that are more and more responsible. And for the purpose of this discussion, I'll be basically using some of the work we've been doing at the PRI on sustainability in supply chains, as well on stewardship, but also specifically in the fashion sector. So hopefully we will be able to bring some quite interesting facts to the discussion.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so let's dive in. And before we dive in, has anyone here in the audience ever been to a garment factory? Okay, good. That's great. So you know a bit about what we're going to dive into, because the question I have, and I want to start with you, Gauri, is what the heck is a missing middle? What are we talking about, and why should investors care?
Yeah, thanks for that. Good to know that some people have visited garment factories. I remember when I visited for the first time 10 or 12 years ago, I was just astounded at the scale, size, and number of people working and touching the clothes that we wear every day. But coming to your question, I think it's important to share a little bit about what manufacturers in the fashion supply chain, what sort of challenges they're going through, what they're being asked to do when it comes to just transition, and sort of try to link that with the financing conversation and investing conversation we want to have today. So a large part of fashion industry's emissions actually lie in the supply chain. So when there are facts that say 80% of the emissions of the industry are actually in the supply chain, and that sometimes maybe we're not able to really relate to as consumers. So when brands set their scope 3 emissions, that's actually the heavy lift is going to be with the manufacturers in the supply chain. And a large part of the fashion supply chain is actually small and medium-sized enterprises. So it's a very fragmented industry. This is something we were discussing earlier. It's very different, very, very small, micro-sized enterprises, highly fragmented. And we obviously have the garment factories, which is what Leslie's question was in the beginning. But we also have organizations that are making the fabric, the yarn, sourcing the cotton, growing the cotton, and making other raw materials. So there's like a huge, long supply chain which ends up on our bodies as clothes. So when we look at that 80% emissions that I referred to, actually a large part of that comes from textile manufacturing. So the processing of fabrics uses a lot of water, a lot of chemistry, and it needs a huge amount of heat. So that's where a lot of coal-fired boilers or fossil fuel-based energy, thermal energy is used to produce clothes. So I'm just setting like a little bit of context, assuming maybe a lot of people are not from the fashion industry here. So that's a little bit about the fashion industry. And what manufacturers are being tasked with right now as part of the just transition is obviously phasing out fossil fuels from their operations. But mind you, they use a lot of energy in textile production, as I mentioned. Textile houses are being asked to move away from wet processing to dry processing. On top of that, there's a lot of social obligations with the upcoming EU regulations. There's a lot more due diligence burden on manufacturers, sometimes duplicative, so multiple brands asking for multiple audits, multiple certifications, all of that cost is borne by the manufacturer. And the last thing, which I think we sometimes don't realize, is these factories are obviously operating in areas where there's extreme heat stress, the planet has become more volatile. Just a few months ago, there was intense flooding in Sri Lanka. Factories are hitting record temperatures in New Delhi, where I'm from, around 50 degrees in the summertime. So factories also have to protect their workers and factories alongside doing all of the decarbonization work. So the reason I kind of share all this is just to give some context on the fashion industry. But I want to also maybe take a minute to link it to the financing needs and investment needs. Another characteristic of this industry, which I highlighted earlier, is that it is inherently quite transactional. Manufacturers, particularly tier 2, tier 3, which is, like I said, fabric making, yarn making, or even SME, small and medium-sized manufacturers, they actually don't have a lot of bargaining power because they're so small and so far down the supply chain. So they don't have visibility on orders beyond 6 months. There are no long-term commitments in the fashion industry when it comes to orders. They're being intensely squeezed on price. They're being asked to absorb the tariffs that are being deployed on them. And they're operating in like a really volatile, short-term environment. And the investments that they're being asked to make, which I was talking about earlier, the coal phase out, the processing technologies are all long-term. So there's this fundamental sort of misalignment, you can say, between how the industry operates and the types of investments they need to make. There's also a bit of misalignment on the fact that these manufacturers do have very, very slim margins, very less power and control, but the risk sits on their balance sheets, as opposed to where the money is, which is with the brand.
So fragmented, like low margins, yet have to deliver on all these things. Yes. No money, but all the responsibility, basically. So it's tough.
I could have just said that, yeah.
No, you said it much better. I'm just trying to say it so I can understand it. Okay, Bob, what do we do about this? Where does finance, how do you get finance come into this?
Yeah, no, I think in terms of the missing middle, it's quite different what you see in other definition of missing middle, because it is a broader sense. Typically, missing middle are seen as companies that are somewhat too big for microfinance, not good enough for the banks, not strong enough for the banks. I think here within the fashion industry, it's also those companies having sales of 5 to whatever 50 million is also the missing middle. Because I think there's a different, as mentioned as well, there's a fragmentation here. So it's not like your typical setup where you do have ownership from the brands with the underlying factories. It's I think in the 80s it started the outsourcing. Basically, factories do need to work with all of the brands, and they're not certain what actually is going to happen next. And there's not this immediate ownership that you would have in other sectors. So it makes it a really difficult setup, because particularly for the longer term financing, what do typically funders and banks do? They want to have a longer term plan, looking for some sort of security, at least that you see whatever you're going to do next is it's going to be rewarded by the brands or in more turnover. And I think that's an element what is really needed in order to make also these institutions, these SMEs, really make them stronger. So what we try to do with the Good Fashion Fund is look at the long term, because I think those SMEs, some of them do have access to shorter term finance, but it's mainly working capital rated, because if their view is basically 6 months, you get 6 months or maybe 12 months of working capital. Whilst if you want to change something in terms of dyeing, in spinning, all of these really capital intense sort of investments, you need a longer term view, you need a longer term picture in order to get there. And that's really what we try to do with the Good Fashion Fund. So that's providing long-term finance. And that's not the only thing. I think also because all of these SMEs are just sort of juggling every day in order to make it work. We also bring them support. So in terms of what do you need to do in terms of new technical equipment, how can you move on the environmental and social side? I think there is a need to bring them to the next level. Because in the fashion industry, the majority is SMEs. So there are a couple of bigger factories, but the majority is what we're talking about, often family set up, so often generation after generation. That's how they try to grow. So there's a lot of rigorness. I think they're extremely resilient, but there's a lack of sort of linkage with a lot of things that are happening maybe outside of their world, internationally, or linkage on knowledge-based, or could even be programs that are interesting for them. Yeah. So what we've tried to do with the Good Fashion Fund is basically help them provide the long-term finance, bring it to the next level, and with a certain level of rigorness from an international funder, at the same time also using the local knowledge and the local network in order to ensure that we know exactly what that they need to do locally, and that it also works.
Great, thank you. And this whole disconnect between short-term transactional and the long-term finance that's needed is so important. And maybe that, to me, makes me think of a very important word, which is stewardship, because stewardship to me is really around a longer term view and thinking beyond that day-to-day profit seeking. And I guess Valerie would love to hear how you think about that in terms of your work with the IGCC, and how do you help what do you have, 36 trillion under assets under management? Okay, so how do you help the 36 trillion better understand the risks and take a longer term view?
Thank you, Leslie. I mean, both Bob and Gauri have so well said sort of the challenges that we're seeing. And the investors that we work with in particular, they don't have that specific sector knowledge. And very often we're talking about investors who would look at the much bigger picture. And in a nutshell, they generally don't like to see too much uncertainty, because that creates a lot of noise in their investment decision-making process. But in the case of investing into emerging markets, the issues that we've talked about on fragmented data, that just comes with it. And for that reason, investors typically will try to focus on quality, focus on companies that are able to demonstrate that they are they have programs in place to work with the supply chain companies down their value chain in terms of how they are demonstrating in the context of climate, what they're doing to support their suppliers into achieving the company level sort of net zero ambitions as well. Because our program mainly focuses on mobilizing investors into engaging on climate transition. And very often, if you don't look into the detail of what the suppliers are doing, there is a huge missing gap from within. And so we will typically see investors start from disclosure, asking for questions around what the principles it is that the companies are adhering to in terms of just transition, the plans that they have in place, and also specific project-specific actions. If we're sort of trying to look for the appetite that investors have on just transition, we do have within the Climate Action 100 Plus initiative that we are a sort of a convening network of, 30% of the engagements in Asia, we do see just transition being one of the top priorities that are being outlined by investors. So there's definitely the intent there to look into it. But then the question might be, what then is the supplier's role in all of this? Because they have a duty in some sense to contribute to the climate goals that are outlined by the company level. And when it comes to the decarbonization strategies that the companies have set out for themselves, it won't be successful without seeing to it that there is that same level of readiness in transition along the value chain. And so typically the areas that would be specifically relevant for the suppliers would be how do they contribute to the Scope 3 emissions? What kind of procurement plans do they have to support to support the company's goal? But all of that said, the bigger question, and perhaps just in line with the main question here, where is the missing link is, are these suppliers adequately supported in order to help the companies meet these climate goals that are being outlined? So I think that comes back to what Gauri has just mentioned. You know, they've got all the responsibilities, but they only have short-term sort of assurance. So whether or not the companies are able to set out such kinds of sort of support in the form of sort of retraining or re-employment to the extent that's necessary, and in terms of if there is sort of diversification plans that would be relevant for the particular sort of sector, then they will need to look into it, that they have plans to support that transition as well. But I think coming back to the apparel sector, what's most relevant perhaps would be the issue around pricing. What's easier to price and what's much harder to price? And I'd say in the midst of all the fragmented data, very often when we talk about worker safety, wages, whether whether there might be cases of excessive overtime, and if in the apparel sector where there might be a little bit more informal work and subcontracted sort of workers, whether they are being sort of exposed specifically to forced labor and human rights issues. All of these are, if you come to think of it, with the exception of safety, which perhaps can be reflected in lost time injury rates kind of pricing mechanisms, the rest of them are really quite difficult to be priced in. And so that is remains to be one of the key challenges that we're facing.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to go to Olivia with something you had said about, are these suppliers at tier 2, tier 3 sufficiently supported? And short answer is no. That's why we're here on the stage. But I think also there's a lot that can be done. And I mean, Olivia, would love to hear from you because, I mean, well, both AIGCC and PRI are not working in fashion specifically. You work across all industries. And, to what extent do your investor members actually understand how deep and challenging it is in, say, fashion? How deep do they go in the supply chain? How do they deal with that?
So investors are increasingly aware that they have a role to play in supporting just transition in fashion supply chains. What that means is a shift also from narrow climate risk management to a holistic approach that protects communities, workers, suppliers, and not just within the corporate boundaries. There are something to take into account when you think about an investor's, it's the business drivers. And there's two. So there's the risk management angle, but there's also the value creation angle that needs to be taken into account. I'd like to differentiate slightly also asset owners and investment managers. Asset owners or anyone doing indirect investments would have a role to play in really setting the expectations. Whereas investment managers or those doing direct the management have a pivotal role to actually translate those expectations into actual practices. And I think that's something that's quite important to mention. So the PRI has launched last year with the support of the Laudes Foundation a study on sustainability in supply chains. And what we saw here is a spectrum of basically activities, I would say, from an investor perspective. and a spectrum of maturity as well. So we have some nascent activities, I would say, around limited structured approach, supply chain impacts not systematically assessed. We have some more standard practices, which include supply chain due diligence, which include a risk assessment conducted, and also internal capacity building. And we have some leading practices as well to look up to, with rigorous monitoring, with alignment with international standards, etc. Sometimes investors are also doing just transition without knowing they're doing it when they have climate strategies, because social dimension is so intertwined that that's also sometimes something to keep in mind. I would say that current norms do emphasize on compliance and sometimes not enough on capacity building for supply chains. And what I'm trying to say here is that without investment in suppliers' capability, compliance becomes a burden rather than a pathway to resilience. And that's something that is quite important. So to a certain extent, we're going for what aspirationally we should be going for is rather a race to the top, rather a race to the bottom. The last point I would mention, and is about stewardship, generally speaking, it's that we've been working with Fashion Revolution for the last year, again, thanks to support also of Laudes Foundation. And we've been looking into investor engagement with apparel and also footwear sector. And try to look for the data needed, but also try to find for avenues for greater investors' mobilization in that sector. And there's 3 takeaways that are quite interesting for this missing middle point. The first one is that when we talk to leaders, investors in that specific topic, they can understand the risks. So it's not necessarily a matter of diagnosing the problem. They struggle to change the outcome, though. So what we see is a gap between risk awareness and real-world impact. And I think you mentioned some of the barriers already that are kind of the sector's business model, the pricing pressures, the short lead times. So that's, of course, barriers to allow for this real-world impact. In addition to that, we found out that effective engagements requires better strategy, not necessarily just more data. And we should focus on understanding what data investors actually really need, and also which engagement approach actually work. And I think this is something that really came out from this work. And my last point, but that's not just necessarily about engagement, although it does fall within the engagement also. It relates to the fact that no single investor can shift global supply chain alone. So there's really a need for collaboration. So within investors, we're talking about collaborative engagements, etc., but also with civil society, with multi-stakeholders, in order to have this system-level change that would actually make us go the right direction.
Yeah, fantastic. And that's music to my ears, given the importance of a systems approach. So I'm going to be cheeky and actually change the questions I'm going to ask you, because I think we've talked a lot about barriers and issues. And I would love to get very practical and understand what's working. So would love to hear from each of you a specific example of where you saw there was an issue or barrier, but then what your organization did to address that, which effectively combines the second and third questions that I was going to ask you. But really would love to hear what's working. So who wants to kick off? Bob? Yeah, please.
I can kick off. I can mention one or maybe 2 very practical examples, I think, of the Good Fashion Fund. In one of them, it's basically a company working also on spinning in India, for instance. They really wanted to upgrade. So they had old machinery, has been there for 25 years. And also they're extremely resilient from family to family, generation to generation. I think they're a really good company. But these are tough times because, as being mentioned, prices basically going down in terms of actually selling it to the brands. Same time, energy prices go up. I think labor costs go up. So there's a lot to be done. But these companies are very resilient. So the idea of that particular company was, and we did that jointly with also technical support from our side, not to buy, for instance, new equipment, but to buy second-hand equipment. And that's typically something that a bank would not do, because they don't like it, because there's hardly any value in terms of the equipment. So we sat down with them, put up a plan in terms of actually to buy the equipment, make sure, gotta test it, because that's a very practical one where we still looked at, of course, the economic lifetime of the equipment. It was all fine, but something, I think, an idea of a very resilient company that really actually couldn't get the money from the banks, didn't have their own resources. So this was a solution to bring it forward. And you can really see we have now done it. We have done the investments in terms of the energy reduction, in terms of the chemicals reduction, waste reduction. It really has a good impact. So I think by doing something simple, but just taking one step further than a typical bank would do, you can actually make an impact. And if you can, one short
Please,
one?
please.
Yeah. I think another one is actually that a company that we work with as well, that a resilient company, somewhat bigger company, but also had the idea that they really want to do something for the female workers. So the idea was really for the female workers to step up to development to the next level. And we, of course, wanted to support on that, so we make an action plan how to do it. But at the same time, it's often about the carrot and the sort of the stick. And this was really a carrot. So we said, well, if you do that, if you can really show that you do have the training, you develop basically the workers, then what we do in terms of our loan, we actually reduce the interest. So it's really sort of a KPI, a social KPI linked loan to make sure that we're all very much aligned. So, and I think it's working well on that side. So I think there's another thing. Sometimes it's a stick to be very, very sort of have the rigor. At the same time, it is also really good to work together with that particular company to get to social improvements.
That's excellent. I love that example. And in fact, in those two examples, you've done two things. One is you've essentially created new norms. I mean, no one can get a loan on old machinery, but you show that that is possible. And hopefully banks can look to that and copy your example. But also money talks. I mean, incentivizing, investment in social outcomes works. So that's a really, really good example. What else are you guys seeing?
I can go next. So one of the key themes when I was preparing for all of this was around certainty, creating certainty for investors. And when it comes to investing into emerging markets, regulatory certainty is one of the key things that are important. But also just trying to respond to then what specifically have we done to sort of address that. And that is, I think we have to recognize when we talk about just transition more broadly, how limiting sometimes that could be without going deeper into the next level, understanding what the place-based realities are in each of the markets, because just transition as it happens in the case of India would maybe be drastically different from that of in Indonesia. And addressing this gap in the knowledge, if you will, our team, sort of focusing on just transition, have put together a report on place-based just transition, which specifically selectively looked into 4 markets, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Japan, looking into the key drivers of just transition in these markets, the challenges that are unique for each of these markets, and the unique traits for these markets, how they differ. And you would find that the impact of transition to each of these communities and workforces and people in EMDEs are vastly dissimilar. And therefore, you can't really sort of pinpoint a generic trend and say that's what's needed for just transition, but rather at sort of that government level, what you need is much clearer policies for that particular market such that it will build investor confidence to invest in that market in the context of just transition. So just to cite a few examples without going into all of the detail of the report, but specific examples of how we define different types of just transition issues. It could range from energy affordability to ensuring that there are income gains for lower income households, to whether or not there are adaptive protective systems in place, and whether there are financing for skills development, especially when it comes to where businesses do need to diversify and transition into something else. So the aspiration around integrating just transition needs to be really integrated into the holistic approach as well. And so one other points that are sort of very close to heart is that when we think about just transition, we need to think about ways to structure the concept into the financing tools, rather than to think about, where is the element of just transition that I can add on to it, because that is also some like a game changer in terms of how we think about the issue.
Yeah.
But I'd be keen to hear more examples as well before I interact further.
That's fantastic. And actually, that is a great call out, that last example, because, I mean, that's very much the work that we're doing at Laudes. I mean, green bonds exist, they've been around for a long time. If you integrate elements of the just side into that, I mean, it's a product that we know that works rather than create something new, because there's way too much new stuff out there and things do work. So I love that idea of building on that. Gauri, what do you see?
Yeah, sure. So I think at FPC, we envision a future where manufacturers are co-creators of sustainability strategies, because that's not happening as of now. So if we apply a bit of that lens, also FPC was formalized just in May with the support of Laudes Foundation, so we still obviously have a lot of work to do with investors. But if I could just share a few examples of co-creation that we've started, which haven't happened in the industry before, and it same could be applied. We could discuss. I was talking to Valerie earlier that same lens could be applied even with investors. So I was talking earlier about how there is a gap in purchasing practices and how sustainability is top down. So with one big fashion brand, FPC has convened their supply chain partners to put all cards on the table and co-create that brand sustainability agenda. And it's open. It's moderated by FPC, so producers are able to share their true, challenges and barriers, and we're really seeing that the brand is open to hearing this and redesigning sustainability, and talking about financing as well. So the same lens or the same model could be applied, where producers and investors collaborate, share their challenges, and come up with something together. Another example that I'll give, which we spoke about earlier, is that SME manufacturers, there's like one person doing HR, compliance, sustainability, like all of that, right? So they are really stretched for resources. So even to decide what to invest in is a task. That in itself is a gap. So one of the tools that FPC is currently designing, and it'll come out in February, is called the Bang for Buck tool. It's designed by manufacturers. So 3 manufacturers have designed this tool, and about 25 apparel manufacturers are vetting and user testing this tool. And it will be open source for all manufacturers in the fashion industry to input any change that they want to make for decarbonization. It could be a new equipment, energy efficiency technology, even, longer term investments like heat pumps, electric boilers, and they can input their data and see how much does it really help them and their specific factory reduce emissions, and what is the ROI. So even something as simple as that helps them decide what investment decisions to make. So I think even technical support designed by manufacturers for manufacturers is a good model that we can recreate.
Love that. And when you talk about co-creation, do you also have workers at the table?
Yeah, I mean, it is really, really important to engage workers in co-creation, because they are the ones, like I mentioned earlier, experiencing these climatic changes. They're the ones also, making our clothes. They're the ones on the factory floor putting in all the hard work. So it's really important to have workers on the table as well.
Yeah. Great. Excellent. Olivia, your thoughts?
So just maybe a point on regulation as well. I mean, shifting trade policies are reconfiguring as well supply chains, introducing new uncertainties that require like careful navigation, I'd say. But in general, investors are now expected to take more holistic views of investees, to actually dwell deeper into the supply chains, to uncover the risk, but also, again, to identify long-term value creation opportunities. And sometimes compliance is a bit the easy route to take that into account. And don't get me wrong, I mean, regulatory drivers help. They do work. We've seen, indeed, a step back with Omnibus and CS-CHD in Europe, with 70% of companies are now reduced from the scope. I mean, does not limit due diligence to direct suppliers. Actually, I think encourage companies to collect information, but there's no expectation on results. So that's clear. SFDR is slightly more positive, although maybe not that direct, but they're still promoting the most virtuous companies. But political cycles do come and go. So I think this is something we have to take into account and deal with to a certain extent. The second point I wanted to mention, which is still something that we hear from investors, is that they cannot fix what they cannot see. And don't get me wrong, I mean, we know that brands with higher ownership, it will be actually, it's better placed to invest in adaptation strategies because, of course, when you have more opaque supply chain, it's more difficult, obviously. But investors also sometimes actually just only do the due diligence for tier one, and they don't go further. So I think here there's something to take into account. And when I hear going from pilots to scale, I'm a bit, I think we shouldn't, I mean, it would be good if a pilot would be working everywhere for all sectors, but it's not necessarily always the case. And I don't think investors should be paralyzed by this, because there's always opportunities to do something where you are currently, what you're doing currently. It doesn't necessarily to be a brand new framework in place. I do have an example if we do have the time for it, but at the PRI, we have the PRI Awards, and in 2025, we had one for engaging for just resilience, and we had Schroders that actually was shortlisted for that PRI Award. And basically, Schroders' proprietary research identified that 5% or more of an apparel brand's net operating profits may be at risk due to productivity loss among supply chain workers exposed to physical climate risk. Flooding, heat, extreme heat, I think you mentioned those two already. And basically, based on that, in 2024, Schroders actually looked into those results and started engaging several of its largest apparel holdings. So looking into fast fashion, premium luxury ones, and basically started actually engaging them with this kind of resilience lens that it wasn't taking into account previously. It started actually urging companies to identify material climate risk across the supply chain. It was actually asking them to assess the financial implication of adaptation and also apply a human rights due diligence lens to climate strategies aligned with the OECD guidelines, or the UN guiding principles, rather. So my point is that there is possibilities to do things already.
Fantastic. I want to switch gears a bit. We still have a good chunk of time, but I'd love to know maybe what doesn't work. Sorry, I'm going rogue on you guys, but I'd like to shake it up because you've all been in the space for a long time. I mean, I know you guys are new as an organization, but you personally have been in the space for a long time. And what I'm trying to really discern is, what is it going to take to give the confidence to investors to come in, to actually make these things investable, but also to maybe be clear on accountabilities? Because what I hear you say in many different ways is we have a situation where basically the companies that have probably the most responsibility to tackle these deep, environmental and social issues probably have the least resources to do so, and there's a lot of expectations. So maybe what have you tried with your organizations that didn't stick? What have you learned from it?
I can start.
Yeah, please.
What doesn't work is, and I think we mentioned it before, but I think it's worth it to mention it again. Short time horizon. That doesn't work. Supply chain transformation, whether we're talking about decarbonization, labor rights improvement, it's multi-year investment. So I think that doesn't work. Some things that work, but that might not be necessarily enough.
Go for it.
And that's in relation to stewardship. So hopefully you'll be able to chime in. Stewardship that focus on disclosure rather than capacity building. it does help, but without stewardship that focuses on capacity building, suppliers remain stuck in compliance mode rather than transition mode. And maybe linked to that, what I would hope for is maybe, and what we heard from investors, is maybe less fragmented asks. Mm-hmm. So if each investor goes with its own priorities and own slightly different asks, that's not necessarily supporting the agenda of moving together. So maybe some kind of prioritization alignment, would say, on what really matters and what needs to be taken as a next step could potentially work, but I haven't seen it yet.
Gauri?
Yeah, I did mention FPC was started in May, but we've existed as an informal network for 5 years. So last year, we did a study with about 25 manufacturers on decarbonization and financing the just transition. So on a very similar topic. So what barriers that were highlighted in the report was availability, affordability, and accessibility of finance. So on availability, I think Bob and I were talking about this earlier, that finance is still going to the larger players in the industry. So, upwards of whatever, $500 million apparel manufacturers who probably do have a lot of more stability and seem more investable. So so a lot of finance is still flowing there and not to the $5 million, $10 million revenue companies that Good Fashion Fund is working with. So that's the availability angle. The affordability angle, although there is concessional debt, favorable terms, favorable interest rates coming in, there's still a lot of, foreign exchange volatility that plays into when manufacturers take on foreign loans, and that could, just a small swing could really wipe out all the interest savings. So there's a lot of reluctance to take on, loans in euros or US dollars. And then in terms of accessibility, I think, again, this is related to the bang for buck tool that I was talking about. A lot of times, even grant applications for 250K, investment is like a really long application. And I understand that obviously funders need a lot of detail, they need feasibility studies, they need KPIs, all of that. But as I was saying earlier, it's like one person is doing the job of 5 people on the shop floor. It's very difficult sometimes to fill out those applications or go through 80-page loan agreements, find legal advice on that. So sometimes these smaller, simpler things that we take for granted. So we did identify these 3 barriers. And at the end of the day, there is still a lot more debt instruments being designed for manufacturers. Again, not co-created, but kind of we were talking about, someone said bottom up. So yeah, these are being designed top down. And so is it really just if, the debt is still being taken on by those that don't have the resources or the long-term visibility of their business?
Thank you. Bob or Valerie?
I can go next. So I think what doesn't work is an overly broad brush definition of just transition. Because and although this may not be an apparel sector sort of example, I remember speaking with the investors to a Indian-based state-owned enterprise, and they were almost dismissive about the notion of just transition. But everything that they've been telling us about the things that they do, because they have to fully consider the huge workforce that are supporting them and the retraining programs, all of that, which would, in my mind, very well fit into the company demonstrating sort of foresight in sort of preparing for themselves for the transition, is they may not have sort of in their report a sort of a just transition principle that they align to. They don't use the same terminology, but when you ask the right questions, they will showcase to you that there are, actually a lot of project-specific plans and activities that are relevant to just transition. And so there's a bit of a sort of the relationship between the investors that are engaging with the company and how sort of receptive the company themselves are, in terms of if a engager, as in the investors, sort of take a broad brush approach and ask very sort of high-level questions that don't really touch upon the nuances of what just transition really needs to be for that particular sector and that particular market, the company could then become quite defensive, even though they actually are doing something. So I think that's something to
That's so interesting. I sometimes think using that term works against us because we all hold a different view of what that actually means. And yeah, it's very interesting to hear that because clearly if companies do that, they're doing the right things and it's good for business. But there's something about narrative. Would love to hear from the rest of you. Bob, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I can tell from, I think from experience what didn't work. So we set up the first fund, which was around COVID time, which was not an easy time, but we really tried at the time to get brands invest in the fund as well. Because we believe that as a really important element is the relationship between the brands and the suppliers, as mentioned before. But it was really tough to get them on. And I do believe also that in that period of time, 2020, 2021, that's something that was also because the whole sector was in difficulty. So I can see it. And I must say, if I look at it right now, you do see more initiatives than there were in place like 5-6 years ago when we started with the fund. The bigger initiatives often still, and as Gauri was also saying, often still, I think, focused on the sort of top suppliers. So you do see the bigger brands focus on the top suppliers. So if that should work, and it should work really, then it means that also the next layer should be incorporated in that. So it's the next step would be basically not just go for the bigger ones, because they already have the capacity, they already have the bandwidth, but particularly target those that actually are below that. I think that's an important one. And maybe one other point, I think, in terms for investors, because the fashion industry, if you look at it 5-6 years ago, it was something which was really not that well known to investors. Also seen as something less a sort of potential reputational risk in that respect, because a lot of things were happening. I think that is moving, because the fashion industry is one of those industries where you see really improvements on the water side, on the energy side, on the materials and the chemicals, but also on the social side. So if you look at the impact that you can make by really making an investment in the fashion industry, it's enormous. It's a slow process, but it's enormous. And I think if I talk to the investors, they say basically, firstly, they say, what is the engagement of the brands? Because we understand now how the market works. So what is the engagement of the brands? The second one is, I find it really difficult basically to assess what it all means. All these certifications, all the audits, what does it actually mean? So where should I go to? So I think in these days where we do have the AI, we do have the capability, we should really try to sort of synchronize that and come with a couple of sort of certifications that would work, because it makes lives easier for the suppliers, but it also certainly will make life a lot easier for the investors.
Absolutely, and this gets back to transparency and data, make sure you have enough sufficient data to make the right decisions. I just have to reiterate what you said, your first example. I still have battle scars from that process of trying to get folks to invest in the first fund, because I think we always assume that the brands would put money into it, and they didn't. It was others.
Yeah, you would assume so. And I think you do see now some initiatives where there are brands working together. And I think that is happening. Was not the case at the time. It's the industry, very fragmented. Everyone's basically looking more at their own suppliers. Yeah. I think it's getting more like an industry approach right now, but still quite a way to go.
Yes, absolutely. So I would love to open it up. We have about 30 minutes left, so we can have a good discussion. So would love to hear from you. Questions for the panelists, and I think we have a mic coming around. And please say your name, your organization, and ask a question instead of make a statement for 5 minutes. Sorry, I love you all, but you know how we all like to do that stuff.
Thank you very much. My name is Tim, and I work on verifiable product data. And my question goes into the context of the European eco-design regulation coming out, and specifically the textile industry is targeted as one of the first delegated acts, and what impact you basically see for that, because especially when I think of brands collaborating with their supply chain, they are reliant for over 60% of their data on their supply chain, even though they're going to be held accountable for its correctness. So I'd love to hear your perspective, if that actually helps, hinders, what does it do to the textile industry from your perspective?
Fantastic. Let's take 2 more questions, and then we can go back to the panelists. Thanks, Tim.
Hi, thank you. Hannah Cool. I'm a specialist in data and transparency, working with banks, linking sustainability data to credit risk, essentially. A linked question. Now, recognising SMEs are the missing link, and accessing data is really hard. We know that. Most SMEs will have a relationship with their bank. Banks are trying to get access to sustainability data, but as we've talked about, it's primarily based in streamlining some of the top-down regulation and data requests that are coming through. So principles-based, carbon reduction-based. It's data and processes and methodologies and calculations that SMEs just don't have the time to do or don't understand. We need to rethink data flows. What data do SMEs have? And can we look through the lens of, does an SME have that data? Can they share that data in an automated or consented way? And maybe then we can actually start to drive better visibility, better transparency.
Fantastic, thank you. Redefining data, yes, please.
I'm Matthias Köster, a member of the board of the Doctors for Environment and Public Health. And my question would be to the panel, how you design a financing system that looks at all the sponge city regions, so you have larger regions, that share the data with the planetary health check community, so Potsdam climate impacts and Stockholm Resilience Center, to name a few, and likewise, because it's a collective global community of, I think, 500 universities currently, and then looking how the WTO, the trade agreements, are designing a new Security Council that is actually taking in youth issues, women, men, gender equity issues, and design financial systems that look at all the I'd say nine different regions, China, Southeast Asia, India, Africa, 1.5 smaller portion to Europe, both Americas, and deliver on the data. Because this way we could have a long-term view and design a new system that includes financings and policy, and asks that with a health view as a doctor for the youth.
Great. Wait, keep the mic for a sec. I want to just make sure I understand the question. Is it how can that happen? Or what's... Okay, good. That's a big question. Thank you. All right, we'll take one more question and then hand it to the panel.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Ashima. I'm an environmental analyst from Lausanne. So my question is about the results. Obviously, you've mentioned the due diligences and the initiatives and the certifications, and so much pressure on the suppliers to meet these demands at the investment level, at the kickoff level, at the implementation level. So I'm wondering if you have structures to track the actual results of these initiatives, whether it's able to reduce impact efficiently, what actually happens, how much it's able to improve the supply chain itself, and how long does it take? Are we still going to wait for it, or is it going to come in next, or is it already coming in? And what kind of time frame that looks like for an industry such as fashion, because the turnaround on the supply itself is very short, hopefully not for much longer, but the results obviously of any environmental impact reduction project will be very slow. So I would love to hear about that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, we'll pause, get some answers, and we can do another round of questions. So who wants to start?
I can just share a bit about the data-related questions. I think what we're seeing, so in the past 5 or 6 years, or maybe longer, 7 years or so in the industry, we were seeing a lot of tools being designed by brands to drive convergence on data collection, so that there is reduced audit fatigue, data collection pressure on manufacturers. So we did have, design tools like the HIG facility environmental management tool, and the social and labor convergence project that came about to drive convergence and drive ensure that there's not so much burden on manufacturers. But increasingly, with ESPR, CSDDD coming in, we're actually hearing from a lot of manufacturers that there is, again, a little bit of divergence, because everyone's reacting really quickly as to, oh, what does this mean for me as a brand and my supply chain, and kind of going back to making their own data collection tools because they need to act fast, right? The pressure is also on them. So they're translating that as their own individual work streams. So a little bit divergence is what we're seeing. And that's, again, translating down into the supply chain as multiple checklists. So one of the things that at FPC we've designed is called a community of practice, where manufacturers, they come together and they learn from each other because they have limited resources and time. But they're all working on the same problem. They're all facing the same problem, of course, in different ways, depends on context, region, revenue, margins, all of that. But essentially, they're experiencing these problems in the same way. So our community of practice is about 6 or 8 sessions where 8, 10 manufacturers have come together, and they're breaking down traceability requirements together and unpacking what that means and putting out. Hopefully, the community of practice ends at the end of January, but hopefully, as a result, obviously taking back the learnings in their company, for which they would probably have to hire individual consultants, and then hopefully putting out thought leadership on for other manufacturers to read and unpack all of this.
And Gauri, would that address what Hannah was saying about really starting to automate certain data flows and reduce the manual element of that?
I think what I was talking about is what is in what can the manufacturers do, what is in their field of control. I think how it comes down from brands, whether it's automated, converged, is a little bit difficult for producers to influence unless we're brought at the co-design, co-creation level.
Great, Bob.
You know, I think the automation is already taking place in quite a few of these SME suppliers. And if you go into a factory, you see sometimes that every week there's another sort of brand or another organization coming and checking it. I think the automation is there. It's just the requests are often in a slightly different way, in a slightly different setup, which means, again, manual adjustments are needed. So it takes a lot of time, hence also the standardization. I think that is needed in that respect. Because I think there's a lot of data already available, particularly if you look at the environmental side. What we've done with our fund, we really did specifically sort of the baselining and looking at the impact of all of our investments, and they needed to sort of top the 50% reduction on that particular element that we're targeting. So that's on water reusage, there's waste reduction, it's the electricity, the savings on electricity. It was all there, and it's not that something new really had to set up. If you look at the new equipment, often a lot of the metering, etc., is already there, and I think those SMEs are capable of doing it. It's just making it easier and sort of standardized for them to work on it. I think that will be a big improvement.
Great, please.
And maybe from an investor lens, I mean from the work we've done and what we heard from investors, we need to move beyond the more ESG data because we actually need to understand what data investors actually need. And also what approach, including engagement approach, actually has an impact on companies. And we still need to actually get this right before adding more, I would say, data points or certification or processes through that.
Yeah, and that was a big question over there about the more holistic view. I'm not sure I even fully understood your question, but I'd love to hear, to your point you just made, how much data is too much data, and if we actually are taking a more systems view and looking holistically, where do we draw the line? And I'm not sure if anyone wants to comment on his question. Yeah, please.
Well, maybe on that point, I mean, I'm just going to talk about the holistic and the I mean, cross-sectoral collaboration. It isn't just a nice to have at this point. It materially improves the quality of ambition and of investor stewardship engagement, etc. So, I mean, I think I mentioned it before, but no single investors can actually just do that on their own. So, cross-sector, cross-actors collaboration is definitely key. So whichever aspect we're talking about.
Can I just add quickly one specific point as well, and that is the mobilization of local investors, because I think we are talking about data being fragmented and trying to have a more systematic way of collecting it, but the interpretation of such data without that local true understanding of how it could be sort of reflected of slightly different things in a specific market sometimes means that you could miss out on very important information that is just sitting right in front of you all the time. And so, and that said though, depending on the market, some local investors are very well versed in climate issues. Others may be in a bit more of a starting journey, but it doesn't matter. Either way, I think there is a lot that local investors can offer as well. By bringing them together with the global investors and having a true sort of learning circle between the two types of investors such that data could be adequately interpreted and acted upon, I think that's also an important point.
Excellent point. What about the eco-design? Does anyone want to comment on that? Is that maybe Bob or Gauri?
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to talk about in the beginning when I was talking about
Okay, the manufacturer's community of practice.
The divergence,
okay.
yeah. I could maybe comment on the question on the impact. I think, it's a very broad question. There's lots of touch points here. But just reflecting, if I can give you a practical example, right? There are a couple of brands that have very strict coal phase-out targets for their textile mills because they signed the UN Fashion Charter and they could not work with textile mills that use coal beyond 2025 even. So they gave like a mandate to their mills that you have to phase out coal or we won't work with you. Again, a very stick approach, no incentive, but more like if you don't do this, we won't work with you. So some of those manufacturers have had to do it within 12 months, phase out coal, right? You would say that's really fast, that's amazing, but for example, in India, the only alternative to coal is biomass. Now for the manufacturer, they had to make the CapEx investment. Biomass also increases your operating costs, so it increases your steam costs by 10 to 15%, but no one's willing to pay more for it. So you could laud that and say, wow, we phased out coal so quickly, we achieved our decarbonization goal. But again, would a manufacturer independently have made that as a sound business decision? Something that adds CapEx and OpEx? Probably not, right? So you can create impact that way too. And the other example is even on the social side, right? Like I worked on projects in factories where even 8-month training programs, soft skills training programs for women, as short as 8 months, have transformational impacts for them, for their families, for their confidence, but also for the business because attrition and retention improves. So there are a lot of, like I think Bob was alluding to it, like there is a lot of work already happening, a lot of investments that manufacturers, because they are family-owned legacy businesses, most of them, they see sustainability as generation after generation continuity, right? So they've been doing it with that vision. They haven't been maybe necessarily doing it because,
That's a good point.
There's external pressures.
Yeah, and that also pulls on the point about capability building over compliance as well and investing in resilience. All right, let's just take 2 more questions. I'll leave it to the mic holder.
Thank you. Espen, a natural capital investment manager. Every second, there's a dump truck full of clothing going to a dump. We doubled production, I just read, in textiles, while the time of wear has dropped. So people are not wearing anything. And if you ask my very environmental conscious daughters, they would say the problem isn't about coal decarbonization, or it's because there's too much fashion. We use too much. And I work in natural capital, and even if you fix all of these other problems, I would say you need to fix the consumption. So my question is, how would you address the missing middle and a just transition in a situation where I think most acknowledge that we need to produce fashion in a totally different way, probably much less of it?
Yeah, that is the elephant in the room question. We'll get to that. Let's take one more, then we'll let the panel.
Hey.
Sorry.
No worries. Lukas Torst from Roskilde University, a researcher, and a big topic in fashion is circular economy. We also talked a lot about data, indicators, metrics, all important to measure impact. With the Global Circularity Protocol, we now have like a harmonized framework from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. However, we don't have a common understanding on how to set targets in circular economy that are like within planetary boundaries, which is my research. So I was wondering which companies you could just suggest for me to talk to learn about how to set circular economy targets that are aligned with planetary limits.
Wonderful. And the answer to your question might help answer that question. So any thoughts you want to share?
I can maybe start. I'm so glad that you raised this point, because I think in a lot of conversations, again, I'm coming back to my original point, because sustainability agenda is fundamentally brand and retail driven, you will often not find two topics that are off the table in a lot of these discussions. Overproduction, because that questions fundamental business models, and purchasing practices, because that's a commercial discussion. Like, let's not bring that into sustainability discussions, right? So I'm so glad that you sort of brought this up. I think the overproduction problem definitely needs to be tackled, but it is a hard conversation to have, again, when the agenda is being set in a top-down manner. So I mean, it's not a perfect answer, but I definitely agree that this is a challenge and that it needs to be solved. The other thing I will say is that, again, relate to circular economy. In the past 10 years or so, we've seen a lot of capital from VCs flowing into startups that are, doing rental, resale, circular, recycled materials, and all of that has, there was a huge boom around this is going to kind of solve some of these problems where there was the whole theory around how, you can continue doubling your revenue while halving your impact. That was the whole, sell of circular economy, that you don't have to stop. You can keep going as fast, but adopt these business models. But I think the reason I'm bringing that up is because we're now seeing that it's becoming quite difficult to scale some of these circular startups, recycling startups, next-gen materials. Again, because it comes back to people don't want to change fundamental business models, and they don't want to pay like pricing premiums or off-takes. So why would I, as a manufacturer, invest in recycling technology or scale it if I don't have off-take or pricing? So I'm kind of trying to answer both questions at the same time, but I hope I've given like a certain picture.
Yeah, maybe on the point of terms of that it's also on the consumer and on the overproduction. In a way, it's a result of how I think the industry has been operating since the 80s. Because if you look at it, the only way to be able to really put a low price tag towards this is because it's not taking into account the social and the environmental matters. So it's at the expense of the nature and the expense of social or the workers, basically, that this could have happened. So we talk a lot about compliance regulations. I think they might be too strict in some cases. On the other hand, it really is moving the needle towards a more sustainable way of producing. And you do already see brands, you do see front runners that really look at different models, that really not only not trying to produce all the time. Fast fashion in itself, of course, every week or whatever, every day having a new collection, it doesn't work. But you see a lot of other brands actually moving into a setup which is more common, which is related to also the real needs and not the overproduction, and actually hence making the consumers overbuy basically what they don't need. So I think it's a result of something what has happened in the past. I'm confident, not just because of the regulations, but also I think of the generation currently, as you're also saying, I think they're looking at it differently. So I do see changes happening, but for me, they can go in parallel. So this reduction in terms of overproduction, as well as doing the sustainable and in a way of producing and working together between brands and suppliers, that is the way forward.
Yeah, and maybe if I can also be a panelist right now, because these things are very close to my heart. And I feel like as a foundation, and for those that are in philanthropy, this is that market failure that we're trying to address. Because as you said, I mean, right now there isn't enough feedstock to feed the recycling innovators to do chemical recycling. So you need to address that bottom up. And there isn't enough demand from the brands to actually take what comes out of that at the right price points. You need to address that. And there aren't enough rules out there like EPR, which actually would put the onus on brands. So it's almost like this chicken before the egg issue, and we're trying to chip away at it, bottom up, top down, and sideways. Not quite there yet, but I think the four of you are each playing a really important role in this. We have about 9 minutes left that I want to give the floor for a final thank you. And what I'd love to hear from each of our panelists is, what's the one insight you'd like to leave the audience with, and what's the one action you hope to see in the coming year in this space to address the missing middle? So maybe we'll start down with you.
I'm first.
Sorry.
I would have two insights. I would definitely call for collaboration, which I did a couple of times during this discussion, but I do feel this is a very important point. So that would be the first one. And the second one would be, for this particular topic, capacity building and investing in the capacity building through the supply chain. Regarding action, as far as the PRI is concerned, we are exploring how we can support investors on supply chain work, but also looking into how, as far as we can support investors' engagements and mobilize them to try to answer or find solutions for all the barriers and challenges we raise. So this is ongoing work, and we hope to be able to work collaboratively with all of our investors on those topics.
Thank you.
Okay, collaboration certainly. I think that's something that's really needed for me. From the brand side as well, I think the good thing is about all this net zero, and I think the commitments being made that brands are looking more at the supply chain, which is really good. I think it's also what they should look at more, and in terms of offsetting, let's not do the offsetting, let's do the insetting. So let's really try to get the efforts within the own industry itself. I think that's really important, because it's easier to offset it, but it's really where the change is needed is in the fashion industry. So for me, that's a really important one. For what I'm going to do practically, as Leslie was already saying, we were actually working on the second fund, which really takes the learnings from the first fund. We have seen many companies, so we also know the market, and we're working together, I think, with those SMEs, because we will be targeting SMEs to see what they need in terms of decarbonization, and find a scalable, standardized setup together with some support, because still support is needed to get them to the next level, but really to have a setup where it is just transition. So it's again following up on the environmental and social side, but really with the support and also with finance, which is more subordinated, which actually give them also the ability to grow without the really pressure on repayment immediately. So that's what we're going to do. So again, just repeating what you said, Leslie, inviting those ones interested, and once again, then the thank you also to Laudes, I think, for the first fund, because Laudes is really a foundation stepping up and really making it work, and collaborating also with other investors to work together on these structures that need some support and risk mitigation, and I think that's also needed for the second fund.
Great, thank you.
So I think the intent of everyone in the room and those listening is definitely here in terms of action. But I think more specifically, ownership of responsibilities that are within your sphere of influence, especially for corporates. There is an example I haven't had the chance to cite just now, but because it's so important for suppliers to be supported throughout the process, there are examples in the electronics manufacturing sector where Scope 3 emissions is also incredibly important, whereby they would set up a dedicated green energy fund to support the suppliers in achieving that and subsequently helping the company also achieve their own net zero targets. So corporates within their sphere of influence, that these are things that they can do. Investors within sort of their area of expertise, where they can look at the really good but smaller scale examples at the moment, where they can feed in their expertise to help scale the financing that's needed. I think that's also, an area where they can work on. So really just a call for action to think really deep and hard into your specific area, how it is possible to contribute to just transition. I think that's crucial.
Thanks.
I think the insight for me has been that people in the investment community, ESG community, do want to engage with supply chains, and they do want to understand the operational challenges and realities. And they are able to understand the short-term transactional nature of our industry. I think 5 or 6 years ago, particularly when I was maybe researching this topic, everyone was like, what are you talking about? So I guess the fact that, you know, an organization like FPC is on the panel, we are here today, it kind of makes me feel hopeful that we're, you know, the supply chain and investment community are ready to engage and work together, which points me to the action, which is co-creation and co-design. Like if you're designing something for a particular industry, for SMEs, for fashion supply chain, talk to them first, understand their challenges, co-create and co-design with them, because they are the ultimate users of the tool. So treat us as partners, not just implementers. And I think Good Fashion Fund is a good example of that and how they're engaging with manufacturers.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for the questions. And I just want to leave you with a couple thoughts. But first of all, this has been a really rich discussion, and we're very proud to be able to support each of you in your work. I think second of all, as you said, I mean, this is happening. Companies, investors see the value in investing in this missing middle, in just transitions in fashion, because there's money to be made. I mean, there was a study that Fashion for Good did a couple years ago that actually estimated that innovation in decarbonization of fashion is about a $1 trillion investment opportunity. So we're not talking about doing this for the good of the world, which is what we want, but it's also a business opportunity and also a business imperative. I mean, as we see extreme heat and other issues that are impacting factories, and you mentioned many of these things, in the missing middle, this is really hard because already there's heat and now you put climate on top of that. So we do need to act. You can make a business out of it. And thank you to the four of you, because we're able to actually make more progress because of each of your four organizations. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just before you go, thank you so much, Leslie, and to all the partners, all the speakers, thank you so much. But just to the audience, before you go, we'd be really interested to have you reflect for 30 seconds on some of the insights you've heard here on stage today. You know, what do you take away with you today? So either chat to your neighbor for 30 seconds, or you can see in the place in the cup holders just in front of you, the little Post-its. We'd encourage you to have a think and write down one thought, one insight, or one action that you commit to take in the next year, which we then invite you to post on the window just outside. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's only a very small token of our appreciation that you are here. It's a vegan nut cake. It's a specialty of this region, and I invite you to share it with all the lovely speakers that were here. And thank you so much for your contributions.